I was in the middle of my solo in Swan Lake when everything went black. One moment I was executing a perfect grand G. The next I was waking up in a hospital bed with doctors telling me I had a brain tumor and might never dance again. The last thing I remember before collapsing was the feeling of weightlessness, that magical moment when a dancer defies gravity and hangs suspended in the air. I'd performed that same jump thousands of times in my 20-year career, but this time my body betrayed me mid-flight. According to the other dancers, I just crumpled to the stage like a broken doll, my white tutu spreading around me like the wings of a dying swan dot. My name is Grace Williams, and at 26, I was the youngest principal dancer in the history of the Chicago Ballet Company. I'd devoted my entire life to dance, starting with tiny ballet slippers at age 3 in my mother's studio in Dallas, Texas. By 5, I was competing. By 12, I was dancing with pre-professional companies. At 16, I left home to attend the elite Chicago Ballet Academy. And at 19, I joined the company as a course member. The path to principal dancer had been brutal but beautiful. 14-hour days in the studio, bleeding feet hidden inside. Pink satin point shoes, a diet so restrictive that I knew the calorie count of every morsel that passed my lips. My body was my instrument, and I tuned it to perfection through decades of discipline, sacrifice, and pure determination. When I joined the company, my roommate was another dancer named Sarah Johnson, a sweet girl from California who danced chorus to ballet. We lived in a tiny studio apartment near Lincoln Park, surviving on ramen noodles and the occasional splurge at the coffee shop down the street. Sarah was the sister I'd never had, cheering me on through every audition, every promotion, every triumph and heartbreak that came with a career in professional ballet. "You're going to be principal before you're 25, Sarah always said, painting my nails between classes. "I can see it in the way you move. You don't just dance, you become the music." She was almost right. I made principal at 25 in 11 months, promoted after a performance of Giselle that had the critics calling me transcendent and a once-in-a-generation talent. The artistic director, Margaret Stevens, a former American ballet theater, prima ballerina, pulled me aside after the curtain call. "Grace, you have something special," she said with genuine warmth in her voice. "Tomorrow, we begin rehearsals for Swan Lake. I want you to dance Odette." Swan Lake, the role every ballerina dreams of dancing, the ultimate test of technical skill, artistry, and emotional depth. I've been preparing for this moment my entire life, studying videos of legendary ballerinas like Margot Fonteyn and Gelsey Kirkland, analyzing every gesture, every port de bras, every subtle expression that transforms a dancer into a character. Rehearsal process was intense. 8 weeks of preparation, working with the choreographer to perfect every detail. The dual role of Odette Audale, the white swan and the black swan, required me to embody both innocence and seduction, vulnerability and power. During the day, I was the pure, tragic Odette, cursed to live as a swan. In the evenings, I transformed into Audale, the seductive imposter who tricks the prince. But something strange started happening during those rehearsals. I'd been getting headaches, not unusual for a dancer pushing her body to its limits. But these were different. They came in waves, usually late at night, sharp and pounding behind my left eye. I chalked it up to stress and the intensity of preparing for the most important role of my career. "You've been rubbing your temples a lot lately," Sarah noticed. One evening as we stretched in our apartment. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was exhausted, but it was more than normal fatigue. Sometimes I felt dizzy during turns, which was terrifying for a dancer whose livelihood depended on perfect balance and spatial awareness. The dizzy spells got worse as opening night approached. During a particular challenging sequence of fouettes, 32 consecutive whipping turns that require incredible core strength and focus, I nearly lost my balance. Margaret noticed immediately. "Grace, take 5 minutes," she called from the front of the studio. "You seem off today." Off. That was exactly how I felt. My body, which had always been my most reliable partner, was suddenly unreliable. My equilibrium was slightly skewed, like someone had adjusted the inner compass I'd relied on for over 2 decades of dancing, but I pushed through. Opening night was in 2 weeks, and I wasn't about to let a few headaches derail the biggest opportunity of my career. I started taking ibuprofen regularly, sometimes 6 or 8 pills a day, just to dull the constant ache behind my eye. The headaches weren't the only symptom I was ignoring. My peripheral vision seemed slightly off, especially on the left side. During partnering sequences with James Parker, my dance partner, I sometimes misjudged distances or timing. James, a consummate professional who'd been with the company for 8 years, adapted seamlessly to my inconsistencies, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Grace, are you sure you're feeling all right?" he asked after a particularly shaky rehearsal where I'd nearly missed a crucial lift. "You seem different lately." Different. Everyone kept using that word, and I hated it. I wasn't different. I was Grace Williams, principal dancer, the girl who'd sacrificed everything to reach the pinnacle of her art form. I couldn't be different now, not when everything I'd worked for was finally within reach. Opening night arrived on a crisp October evening in Chicago. The theater was sold out, and I could feel the anticipation in the air as I applied my stage makeup in the dressing room shared with 3 other principal dancers. The transformation from Grace Williams into Odette was always magical. The white base makeup, the elaborate headpiece with its delicate feathers, the pristine white tutu that would catch the stage lights and make me appear to glow. "Places in 5 minutes," the stage manager called over the intercom. I took one last look. In the mirror, the reflection staring back at me was everything I'd ever dreamed of becoming. A prima, ballerina on the verge of her greatest triumph. The headache was there, as it had been for weeks, but I'd learned to compartmentalize it, to push it into a corner of my consciousness, where it couldn't interfere with my performance. The first 3 acts went beautifully. I felt connected to the music, to the character, to the story I was telling through movement. The audience was completely engaged, and I could feel their energy feeding my performance. During the famous dying swan sequence at the end of Act 2, there wasn't a sound in the theater except for Tchaikovsky's haunting melody. But Act 4 was where everything fell apart. The final act of Swan Lake is the most demanding, both technically and emotionally. Odette, realizing she's been betrayed and that her love can never be, chooses to die rather than remain cursed forever. It's a sequence that requires absolute precision, soaring jumps, intricate footwork, and the emotional maturity to convey. A character's journey from hope to despair to transcendent acceptance. I was in the middle of the final variation, building toward the climactic series of grand jeets that would carry Odette to her fate, when the headache exploded behind my left eye with a violence I'd never experienced. For a moment, the pain was so intense that I couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but try to stay upright on stage. But I was Grace Williams, and the show must go on. I forced myself to continue, to execute the choreography I knew, by muscle memory even as my vision started to blur around the edges. The audience, the orchestra, the other dancers, none of them could know that anything was wrong. That's when I went into the grand jeet. That would change my life forever. I approached the jump with all the power and precision I cultivated over 20 years of training. My supporting leg pushed off from the floor, my working leg extended in a perfect line. My arms framed my face in the classical position I'd practiced thousands of times. For a moment, I was flying, weightless, perfect, exactly where I was supposed to be. Then everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in Northwestern Memorial Hospital's neurological intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and kept track of functions my body had apparently forgotten how to manage on its own. My parents were there, flown in from Dallas, looking older and more worried than I'd ever seen them. Sarah was curled up in a chair by the window, still wearing her rehearsal clothes. Grace? My mother's voice was soft and careful, like she was, afraid I might break if she spoke too loudly. Sweetheart, can you hear me? I tried to speak, but my throat felt raw and foreign. A ventilator had been breathing for me while I was unconscious, the doctors later explained. When I finally managed to croak out a yes, my mother started crying. Dr. Michael Chun, the neurosurgeon who had been managing my case, came in to explain what had happened. The headaches, the dizziness, the visual disturbances, they'd all been symptoms of a mass growing in my brain, specifically in the left parietal lobe, the area responsible for spatial awareness and motor function, Dr. Chun said, his voice gentle but direct. It's a type of brain tumor that can grow quite aggressively. The good news is that we caught it before it caused permanent damage to your brainstem or critical functions. The challenging news is that it's located in an area that controls movement and coordination. Movement and coordination, the very things that had defined my existence for the past 23 years. Can you remove it? My father asked, his engineer's mind immediately jumping to solutions. We can try, Dr. Chun said, but the surgery is extremely complex. The tumor is intertwined with healthy brain tissue that controls fine motor skills. There's a significant risk that removing it could affect Grace's ability to walk, let alone dance. The silence in that hospital room was deafening. My entire identity, everything I'd ever worked for, everything I was, it all hung in the balance of a surgery that might leave me unable to walk. What happens if you don't operate? Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Chun's expression grew more serious. The tumor is growing rapidly. Without intervention, we'd be looking at weeks to months before it affects critical brain functions. Weeks to months. I was 26 years old, and we were talking about weeks to months. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. That gave me 4 days to process the fact that my life as I knew it was over, regardless of the outcome. If the operation was successful, I might survive but never dance again. If it wasn't, I might not survive at all. Those 4 days in the hospital were the longest of my life. Friends from the company came to visit, bringing flowers and cards and carefully cheerful conversation that avoided mentioning the obvious that my career was finished. Margaret Stevens came on Saturday, bringing with her a program from opening night with a note from the entire company. The performance was extraordinary, Grace, she said, holding my hand. Right up until the moment you collapsed, it was the most beautiful Swan Lake I've ever seen. You gave everything you had to that role. Everything. Yes, I had given everything. And now there was nothing left. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday morning. Dr. Chun explained that it would take approximately 8 hours, depending on what they found when they opened my skull. The plan was to remove as much of the tumor as possible while preserving the surrounding healthy tissue, but there were no guarantees about what functions might be affected. I have to ask, I said to Dr. Chun during our final pre-surgery consultation, what are the chances I'll ever dance again? He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Grace, given the location of the tumor and the extent of the surgery required, I'd say the chances of returning to professional level dance are very small. We'll be focused on preserving your ability to walk and maintain basic motor functions. Basic motor functions? I'd gone from being one of the most physically gifted people in the world to hoping I'd retain basic motor functions. The night before surgery, Sarah stayed with me in the hospital room. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that we hadn't already covered. Instead, we watched old videos of ballet performances on our laptop, losing ourselves in the beauty of movement I might never experience again. Remember when we first met at the academy? Sarah said around midnight as we watched a recording of Mikhail Baryshnikov dancing with American Ballet Theater. You were so intimidated by everyone else, convinced you weren't good enough to be. There, I did remember. I'd been 17, surrounded by dancers who seemed more polished, more confident, more naturally gifted than I was. I'd called my mother crying after the first week, begging to come home. You told me that the only thing that mattered was wanting it more than anyone else, I said. That technique could be taught, but desire couldn't be faked. You wanted it more than anyone I'd ever met, Sarah said softly. That's what made you special. Not just the way you moved, but how much you loved it. Loved. Past tense. Because after tomorrow, that love might be nothing more than a memory. Morning of surgery arrived gray and drizzly, typical Chicago October weather. My parents were there early, along with Sarah and several other friends from the company. Dr. Chun stopped by to review the procedure one more time and answer any final questions. Are you ready? He asked. I wasn't. I'd never be ready to potentially lose everything I'd ever been. But I nodded anyway. The pre-surgical preparations felt surreal, signing consent forms that acknowledged I understood the risks, including death, permanent disability, and loss of motor function. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, explained that they'd be monitoring my brain activity throughout the surgery to ensure they didn't damage critical areas. We'll wake you up periodically during the operation, she explained. It might seem strange, but we need you conscious for certain parts of the surgery so we can test your responses as we work. Awake brain surgery. They were going to operate on my brain while I was conscious, testing my ability to move and speak as they cut into the organ that controlled everything I was taught. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I caught a glimpse of the surgical team preparing their instruments. Dr. Chun was already scrubbed in, studying the MRI images of my brain projected on monitors around the room. The tumor showed up as a dark, irregular mass, like a shadow that had taken up residence in my head. Okay, Grace, Dr. Chun said as they positioned me on the operating table. Let's see what we can do. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took hold was a strange sense of gratitude. Whatever happened in the next 8 hours, I'd had 26 years of dancing. I'd experienced the pure joy of perfect movement, the transcendence of becoming something more than human through art. Not everyone gets to live their dream, even for a little while. But as it turned out, the surgery that was supposed to save my life nearly killed me instead. During the operation, something went wrong. Later, Dr. Chun would explain that the tumor was more extensively intertwined with healthy brain tissue than the scans had shown. As they attempted to remove a particularly stubborn section, they inadvertently damaged a blood vessel, causing significant bleeding in my brain. We had to make some quick decisions, Dr. Chun told my parents while I was still unconscious in recovery. The bleeding was severe, and we were losing her. We managed to stop it, but the trauma to the surrounding brain tissue was more extensive than we'd hoped. More extensive trauma. Medical speak for we might have made things worse while trying to make them better. I woke up from that surgery unable to move the right side of my body. My right arm hung limp and useless at my side. My right leg refused to respond to commands from my brain, the fine motor control that had allowed me to balance on the tips of my toes for hours at a time was completely gone, but I was alive. Against the odds, despite the complications, despite the extensive trauma to my brain, I was alive. The next 6 years would test that life in ways I never could have imagined. I'm Grace Williams, and this is how I learned to walk again.